Hey everyone, ready to dive in. We're tackling something today that I know a lot of you are really passionate about, criminal justice reform.
Yeah, it's a big one.
It really is. We've been digging into your notes, and there was this super interesting ChatGPT conversation about rehabilitation versus retribution. That whole debate, are we actually trying to change things or just focused on punishment?
And you were looking at how socioeconomic factors kind of make that question even more complicated, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
It all started with this thought experiment, almost like a what-if scenario.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
It was about imagine trying to take someone who's developed all these survival skills in a really harsh environment, and I mean harsh almost like, trying to get a wild animal to adapt to living in a zoo or even our homes.
Interesting comparison.
Yeah, it makes you wonder, does that kind of background, that experience, does make someone almost unfit for what we consider normal society?
It's a really thought-provoking analogy, and it gets right to the core of what we're talking about. Can somebody truly leave their past behind? Especially if their past was, shaped by really difficult circumstances.
Right, where do you even draw the line between personal responsibility and the impact of your environment?
Exactly.
So how do we even begin to untangle that? Like, is genuine rehabilitation even possible, realistically, if someone's whole life has been impacted by things like poverty, lack of opportunity, maybe even exposure to criminal activity from a really young age?
And here's where it gets fascinating. While that wild animal comparison is really powerful, humans aren't just operating on instinct. We
Right.
have this capacity for learning, for adapting, and I think most importantly, making conscious choices that animals just don't have.
So it's less about being domesticated and more about tapping into our potential for change, even if someone's starting point was completely different.
Exactly. But then the question becomes what actually leads to successful rehabilitation, especially when we're talking about people whose lives have been so heavily impacted by these socioeconomic factors. And research really shows it's this complex mix of, individual will and having the right support systems in place.
Okay, so let's unpack that a little bit. On the individual side of things, what are some of the factors that might make someone more likely to thrive in a rehabilitative setting versus, just serving out their time?
Well, adaptability is huge. Just like some people are hardwired to thrive in a bustling city, while others, really need the quiet of the countryside to do their best work. A similar principle applies here.
So even within a structured system like prison, there's still that need to adapt to a different kind of normal.
Exactly. But it goes beyond just like your personality, right? Your
Hmm.
personal history, particularly if trauma is part of the picture, that can be a major roadblock on the path to rehabilitation.
Because even if someone is physically safer than they might be used to, internally, it's like they're still in survival mode.
That's a great way to put it. And that internal struggle, it can make it so much harder to embrace change, even when it's positive change. And of course, that's where the individual's own desire to change comes into play, right? You can have all the support in the world, but if someone isn't truly ready to do the work, to change their mindset, it's an uphill battle.
It's like any other type of personal growth, right? You could have the best therapist in the world, but if you're not showing up, ready to do the work, it's not going to stick.
That's such a great analogy. But here's where those societal factors come in. Let's say someone IS motivated to turn their life around, they need a supportive environment to actually make it happen.
It's almost like telling someone to relax and enjoy the view when they're clinging on to a cliff edge for dear life. Their basic needs have to be met before they can even begin to think about anything else.
Exactly. They need access to opportunities. Think education, job training, stable housing,
Hmm.
things that a lot of us, take for granted. And even more importantly, they need to be surrounded by positive social networks. Without those, it's like trying to climb out of a hole without a ladder.
You're constantly at risk of falling back in, right?
Exactly.
It makes you wonder how much of this rehabilitation versus punishment debate is really about individual will versus like the environment they're released into. Can we really say someone truly had a chance if the deck was stacked against them from the start?
It's a huge question, and it's something that the user in this ChatGPT conversation was really wrestling with, too. They were really curious about countries that seem to be getting it right,
Yeah.
where rehabilitation isn't just a buzzword, but it's actually working.
So are there such places? Are there countries that are actually getting this right, where rehabilitation is more than just a feel-good idea?
There are definitely a few standouts, places that come up again and again as examples of what a more rehabilitative approach can actually look like in the real world.
Okay, so hit me with it. Who's doing this well? Where should we be looking for inspiration?
Well, Norway consistently tops the list, and for good reason. Their whole system is based on this idea of humane prisons. And I don't just mean humane in terms of, basic living
Right,
conditions.
it's more than just like giving people fluffy pillows and cable TV, right?
Yeah. Exactly. It's about recognizing the inherent dignity of every individual, regardless of their past mistakes. It's about understanding that most people who are incarcerated are going to re-enter society at some point. So the goal is to make that transition as smooth and as successful as possible.
So paint me a picture here. What does a truly humane prison look like in practice? How is it different from, say, a more typical maximum security facility?
Well, imagine this. Instead of focusing on punishment, on isolation, on stripping away someone's sense of self, they prioritize preparing them for life after release.
Okay, so it's not just about being nice to prisoners, but about actually addressing the underlying issues that might have led them to criminal behavior in the first place.
Right. Exactly. For example, take Basti Prison. It's on an island in Norway, surrounded by nature. Inmates have a lot of autonomy. They work on the farm, they cook their own meals. They even have a recording studio where they can learn music production.
Hold on, a recording studio in prison. That sounds more like a retreat center than a place of punishment.
You see, that's exactly the point. It's about giving people skills, purpose, a sense of agency. It's about treating them as individuals capable of growth and change, not just as the sum of their worst actions.
And does it work?
Well, Norway has one of the lowest recidivism rates in the world, so clearly something about this approach is working.
That's pretty compelling. But I have to ask, is this just a Norway thing? Maybe it's something in the Scandinavian water?
That's a fair point. We do have to be careful about drawing broad conclusions from a single example. But Norway isn't alone. Sweden has a really fascinating approach with their open prisons.
I've heard that term thrown around, but I'll be honest, it kind of conjures up images of prisoners just like strolling out whenever they feel like it, which I'm guessing is not accurate.
Not quite. It's less about a lack of physical barriers and more about creating a sense of personal responsibility, building trust. Inmates in open prisons in Sweden have a significant degree of freedom within the facility. They can move around more freely, hold jobs, have family visits. The idea is to make the environment as similar to life outside of prison as possible.
So, almost like a halfway house, but within the prison system itself. Sounds like a good way to ease that transition back into society, which I imagine can be pretty jarring otherwise.
Exactly. And along with that, they really prioritize resocialization programs, therapy, counseling, job training, you name it, all with the goal of addressing the root causes of criminal behavior and giving people the tools they need to build a better life once they're released.
So there's a recognition that just locking someone up, even for an extended period, it doesn't magically solve the underlying issues that might have led them there in the first place.
Exactly. And it's not just those individual needs either, right? It's about recognizing that everyone, regardless of their past mistakes, has something to offer. Denmark, for instance, they share Norway's focus on humane prison conditions, but they're particularly known for their emphasis on education and vocational training within the prison system.
It's like that old saying, give a man a fish.
You feed him for a day, teach a man to fish, and you feed him for a lifetime. And in this case, you might just equip them with a skill set that can help them build a whole new life for themselves, potentially breaking that cycle of reoffending.
It's not just about punishment then. It's about restorative justice as well.
100%. And then there's the Netherlands. They've been incredibly successful with alternative sentencing, things like electronic monitoring and community service. But even more interestingly, they're very focused on prevention. They invest heavily in social support systems to try to prevent crime from happening in the first place.
So it's a more holistic approach, right? Addressing the underlying social and economic factors that often contribute to criminal behavior rather than just reacting after the fact.
You got it. Creating a web of support, both within and outside of the prison system, that gives people the best possible chance to turn their lives around. Now, contrast that with what we often see in other parts of the world, the emphasis on punishment over rehabilitation, the overcrowded prisons, the lack of reintegration programs. It really makes you wonder which approach is more likely to break the cycle of crime.
It's like two completely different philosophies when it comes to justice, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. One sees people as inherently redeemable, capable of change, while the other sees them as defined by their worst actions, and their approaches to this whole idea of rehabilitation or lack thereof really reflects that difference.
It makes you wonder, if these alternative approaches are demonstrably more effective, why aren't more countries adopting them? I mean, what are the roadblocks here? Why are we so resistant to change?
Well, that's where things get a bit more complicated, I think. There's often a lot of fear surrounding criminal justice reform, fear of seeming soft on crime, fear of public backlash, fear of the unknown. The user you were talking with even brought up this whole issue of outliers. Those individuals who might not respond to even the best rehabilitative efforts.
Right, and it's a valid concern. To a degree, we can't just ignore the fact that there will always be people, for whatever reason, who aren't able to successfully reintegrate back into society, no matter how much support they're given. It's almost like we're designing our healthcare system only around the people who don't respond to treatment,
Yeah.
instead of focusing on the majority who could actually benefit.
Wow, that's a really powerful way to put it. And the thing is, when we operate from that place of fear, when we assume the worst in people, we actually create a self-fulfilling prophecy.
We end up building a system that almost guarantees failure, even for those who might have thrived if we had just approached it differently.
Exactly. We pour all of these resources into punishment, into building more prisons, instead of actually trying to address the root causes of crime.
Right, because it's not like most people just wake up one morning and decide, hey, I think I'll become a criminal today.
Exactly. There are so many factors at play: poverty, lack of education, untreated mental health issues, things we could be addressing proactively.
But it's so much easier to just lock people up and forget about them, right? Out of sight, out of mind.
It's definitely easier in the short term, but in the long run, it's incredibly costly, both in terms of actual dollars and in terms of human potential. And speaking of cost, the user in your conversation was clearly wrestling with that aspect too, especially when it comes to the economic arguments we hear all the time.
Oh, you mean that whole why should we pay for criminals to have a better life than law-abiding citizens
Yeah.
line?
Yep, that one. But here's something that often gets overlooked. A more compassionate approach, one that prioritizes rehabilitation and reintegration, it's actually more fiscally responsible in the long run.
Wait, so you're telling me that being tough on crime, it might actually be the more expensive option? How does that work?
Well, it all comes down to those recidivism rates we were talking about earlier. When we actually give people the tools and the support they need to turn their lives around, things like education, job training, access to mental health services, they're far less likely to wind up back in prison.
Which saves us all money in the long run.
Yeah.
Because let's face it, prisons are not cheap.
They are incredibly expensive, not just in terms of actually keeping people fed and housed and, behind bars, but also the lost economic potential. Instead of contributing to society, holding down jobs, paying taxes, they become dependent on the system.
It's like this whole other economy operating in reverse.
Exactly. But when we invest in rehabilitation, we're essentially investing in turning former criminals into productive members of society. They can get jobs, start families, pay taxes, they contribute to the economy, rather than draining it.
So it's not just about doing the right thing morally, it actually makes economic sense as well.
Precisely. Plus, all of those benefits, you can't really put a price tag on: safer communities, stronger families, less fear and anxiety. It has a ripple effect.
It makes you wonder why this isn't the dominant narrative when it comes to criminal justice reform. Seriously, if we're being honest with ourselves, what's more expensive? Constantly cycling people through the system or investing in their rehabilitation and giving them a real shot at a second chance?
It's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's interesting, the user you were talking with seemed to be grappling with a similar question when they brought up the whole concept of turning the other cheek.
That's an interesting connection. I don't think I would have necessarily put those two things together, criminal justice and, turning the other cheek. It seems almost too radical, maybe.
It does, doesn't it? But if you really think about it, there are some surprising parallels between that principle, turning the other cheek, and the ultimate goals of rehabilitation.
Okay, I'm listening. Help me connect the dots here.
Well, at its core, isn't turning the other cheek about choosing not to respond to harm with more harm? It's about interrupting that cycle of violence or retribution and choosing a different path.
So instead of just perpetuating that cycle, it's about, how do we actually heal? How do we move forward in a way that's actually healthy?
Exactly. And isn't that what rehabilitation is all about? It's recognizing that even those who have caused harm are capable of change, of becoming productive members of society.
It's about recognizing their humanity, even as we hold them accountable for their actions.
Yes. It requires a real shift in perspective, a willingness to see beyond the crime itself and recognize the potential for growth and transformation.
It's a much more hopeful approach, I think. And honestly, don't we need a little more hope in the world right now? especially when it comes to these really complex issues.
We absolutely do. It's so easy to get bogged down in the negativity, to focus on the failures, the outliers. But when we do that, we lose sight of something really important. The very human potential that exists within each of us to learn, to grow, to make amends.
And to create a world that's a little bit kinder, a little bit more just, one transformed life at a time.
Beautifully said.
Well, that's it for today's deep dive, everyone. It's clear this debate over rehabilitation versus retribution, it's not going away anytime soon. But by really digging into these different perspectives, by challenging our own assumptions, and by daring to imagine a different way forward, maybe, just maybe, we can start creating a world where justice and compassion aren't opposing forces, but two sides of the same coin. Until next time, keep asking those tough questions and keep those minds open.